Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. In the Zen tradition, they talk about something they call the great matter, or we might say like the big question, which is the question of birth and death. And this was also the principal dilemma that the Buddha, before he became the Buddha, when he was a bodhisattva, this is the principal dilemma that he faced, was the nature of life and reality of birth, sickness, old age, and death. And he saw this as a great crisis faced by every individual, and no one understood the process or why it was happening or what to do about it. In modern times, we call it sometimes the existential dilemma. We know that we are in between these twin posts of birth and death, and we're always moving from one to the other. Every moment we're one moment closer to our inevitable death. The process begins, at least in this life, in this cycle, begins with birth, which is the coming into being, the start of a new form, a new continuum. In Buddhist philosophy or Buddhist thought, there's considered to be 4 different modes of birth. There's the egg-born, womb-born, moisture-born, and spontaneously arisen. As human beings, we're in the category of womb-born. This is the way mammals reproduce. The new organism is formed inside the body of the mother. Egg-born are like birds or reptiles. They lay an egg, and the egg forms a new being. Moisture-born was a category based on primitive biology, and we had a similar concept in the West. They didn't really know where some kind of lower animals like flies came from. They would see maggots forming in decaying meat, for example, and the theory was that they were generated in the moisture of the meat. So moisture-born. Spontaneously born refers to supernatural beings like devas and spirits that just appear spontaneously, fully formed. Of course, what's most appropriate or most concerned to humans is the category of womb-born. And it's said that a new life begins when 3 elements come together: the seed of the father, the blood of the mother in her time. Of course, they didn't know about the mammalian egg. That requires a microscope to understand that, but they thought it was blood and semen that produced the new life. And the 3rd element is the Gandhabba, seeking rebirth. This is the spark of consciousness coming from a previous existence. That in the continuum of momentary arising, it requires this 3rd element. And I think you can often see that with young children, that there's some aspect of the child's nature that you can say, oh, it's taken after mommy, or another aspect, oh, just like his old man. but they often have something unique that, where'd that come from? And it is not readily explained without considering a third element. And then the individual begins in the womb as a fertilized egg and then begins multiplying and forming. The cells multiply and then they form organs and limbs, and development goes on. And this process is actually quite a mystery even to modern science to understand and explain how the organism forms. When you consider the development of a embryo in the womb, it's quite a wondrous, kind of miraculous thing that you start out with a few undifferentiated cells. You start out with one cell, then it splits and splits a few times. You have a lump of undifferentiated cells, the stem cells. And then somehow they figure out, okay, this one is going to be a nerve cell, this one's going to be a muscle cell, this one's going to be a bone cell, and they move around into the right positions and form into the correct organs and shapes. As I said, it's not well understood by science. We know the genetic code, we've cracked the genetic code, and we understand the workings of DNA and RNA. But basically what those things are is simply a recipe for protein replication. And this part is well understood, that the string of amino acids will form off of a strand of DNA according to the coding in the DNA and form a protein. But then the first thing that happens when the string, and it's a linear strip of amino acids, separates from the DNA, it curls itself up into a three-dimensional shape. This is called protein folding. And it's required for the proper functioning of the organism that these folds occur correctly. It's a complex three-dimensional shape, and there's hundreds or thousands of ways it could go wrong, and it seldom does. If it goes wrong, that's something pathological. But almost entirely, every moment in your body, this is happening. These proteins are forming into these complex three-dimensional shapes. And nobody really knows how they do that. And that's only the first step in the process of forming a human organism. That the proteins are building blocks of the cells, and the cells are the building blocks of the organs. And there's such a complicated interlayering of blood and nerves and muscle and bone, everything in its right place. There is a modern writer, a kind of maverick biologist that I highly recommend. Is a man called Rupert Sheldrake. You can look him up. He's written a number of books. And he started his career as a embryologist, studying the development of embryos. And this was his primary question that he asked: is how does this occur? This morphogenesis is the word he uses. Morpho meaning form or shape. Genesis, the beginning or creation. How does a shape? How does a body take shape? And he realized that up to this point, science had not really explained it. And he came up with a theory of what he calls morphogenetic fields, which he says are pure information fields, not located in space, non-local. They're just pure information. And they're the extra. He says there's not nearly enough information in the DNA to explain a whole body in every detail. So there must be an additional source of information. And he posited these pure information fields, morphogenetic fields, and they sound very much like mind. Now, to a Buddhist looking at that, this is mind. There's pure information, not local, not localized in space, with no material basis, just pure information. In the Buddhist teachings, the beginning of a being is described in the dependent origination as consciousness is the cause of name and form. And name and form means the body and mind. The full formula for this section of the dependent origination is because of ignorance, karmic formations, because of karmic formations, consciousness, because of consciousness, name and form, because of name and form, 6 sense bases. So to explain this a bit, what this means, because of ignorance, karmic formations, we are, all of us, unless we're fully enlightened arhants or Buddhas, we're, to some less or greater degree, we're ignorant. We don't really know what we're doing. We're, as it were, stumbling around in the dark, thrashing about, knocking things over. This is the normal life of a human being. And this is the karmic formations. We do stuff. And everything we do, every action we take with body, speech, or mind has a weight of karma attached to it. Now, think about karma. The best way to think about karma is as a natural law. Something like the law of gravity or the law of conservation of momentum. When you take an action, it's as if you're disturbing the universe a little bit. You're putting a ripple out into it. And the universe has a very strong tendency, an innate tendency to balance itself, to come back to zero. We see this in things like the conservation of momentum. So on the plane of mind and of ethical action, karma is like a disturbance into the universe. And the person making the karma then at some later time receives the result of that karma as the universe balances itself. It's inevitable and it's natural. It's not a judgment, it's not a punishment or a reward, it's just a natural balancing. And because of these actions and the karma created, there's an impulse from mind to alight here and there. And the particular case of the moment of rebirth, the consciousness that arises has been conditioned by previous actions. It's necessary for every moment of consciousness to have had a previous moment to condition it, else it's a new creation, a creation without a cause. And Buddhist philosophy rejects the idea of anything being without a cause or a condition. Everything is conditioned. So any moment of consciousness throughout the day, throughout your life, had a previous moment. You can trace back your whole day and many days. There's always a continuity of consciousness. But at the very first moment of consciousness arising in the womb, that's not a new creation either. that has a previous moment conditioning it. And in the sutta, it's called the Gandhabba seeking rebirth. And in the dependent origination, it's called the Padisanda Vijnana, the consciousness arising in a new birth. And this comes from previous lifetimes. And by the conditioning of the karma, this determines the nature of the birth. The consciousness will seek a site of birth that it is conditioned to. So in the case of someone who has the karma to be reborn human, the consciousness will arise in a womb at the moment of conception. In the case of a consciousness that's going to become a chicken, it arises in the egg. So it's this non-material, empty, void nature of consciousness that is the first seed of information that allows the unfolding of the organism in the womb. And it will be in a suitable womb, human or an animal womb, according to the karma made previously. And the organism then becomes formed, and eventually it separates from the mother. This is what we call birth generally in our terminology, but in the Buddhist text, birth is usually actually means conception, because that's considered the start of a new continuum. And then the organism continues to develop and grow and become an adult, and is constantly in a state of change. The body is constantly refreshing itself, renewing itself with material from the outer world. With every breath you take, you're exchanging molecules with the atmosphere. And then you eat and excrete, there's more transfer. So nothing is really permanent or persistent. But what gives an illusion of persistence is the form. Not the material, but the form that changes more slowly over time. But it does, it's constantly changing. You can think of a body, a living body, as like a ripple in a stream, or a whirlpool, the type of thing in a stream. You have a whirlpool in the stream, the material is constantly changed. The water's coming in and going out, but for a time there's a persistent pattern in the water. It's like the body is a pattern that persists as the material moves through it. And the mind, too, is impermanent and changeable. It's changing faster than the body. The mind is constantly in a state of flux and renewal. The feelings change, the perceptions change. Consciousness is constantly alighting on new objects moment by moment. This is the nature of impermanence. It's one of the core principles, one of the three characteristics, is the impermanent nature of things, the transient state of being in flux. And every pattern eventually breaks up. And this is the state of impermanence on the scale of a human lifetime, is that every human lifetime comes to an end. Everyone eventually dies. And the death is a great mystery. The only one thing we know for certain about death is that it's inevitable, that we can't escape it. But we don't know when it's going to happen. We don't know where it's going to happen. We don't know how it's going to happen. And we don't know what comes after. It all remains a great unknown to us. What happens in the Buddhist description of the process, which we can state in general terms without, we can't know our own specific details, but in general terms, consciousness is arising at each moment to an object and is driven in that way by the force of desire or craving. And this is what keeps us in existence. This is the fundamental nature of samsaric becoming, is craving, driving consciousness to take an object. This happens moment after moment. And this goes up to the moment of death. And the moment of death is exceptional only in that the previous organism, the body and the structure of the mind as it exists, is no longer functional. But at the moment of death, if the being is not fully enlightened, which is the case, the vast majority of cases, then there's still craving, and consciousness still arises in the next moment to seek an object. But it no longer can arise in the same, on the same base, in the same matrix of body and mind. So then the force of karma comes into play, and the consciousness arises somewhere else, in a new existence, in a womb at conception in a human case. And there's a great forgetting, because this process of death and embryonic development and birth is so traumatic that any previous memories are muddled and lost. In Western culture, there tends to be an image of existence of the embryo in the womb as kind of a blissful state. It's kind of held in this warm embrace and like an oceanic kind of state. In the Visuddhimagga, ancient Buddhist text, talking about the process of birth and death, talks about an embryo in the womb as in a constant state of suffering, that you're in this tight, dark, hot space, and it says if the mother eats something with hot chilies, you feel like you're burning up. And it just describes it as, being a very unpleasant existence. And then when the time comes, it's then thrust out into the daylight, and another mode or type of suffering begins. And eventually, having been born, it grows up, it ages, it sickens and dies. And the process starts over again. The Buddha recommended in many times, in many places, the importance of contemplating impermanence, to always remember our own death, to remind ourselves that I too shall die, I too shall pass away, and that there's no escaping from it. And this is something else that we do in our culture. We tend to want to avoid talking or thinking about death. It's too morbid, it's too grim, we don't want to go there. But the Buddha recommended reminding yourself every day that you're mortal, that you're going to die, you're going to pass away. At one time, the Buddha was teaching some of the monks, and he asked them, how do you contemplate impermanence? And one monk said, every morning when I get up, I remind myself, this could be my last day, I better make it worthwhile. The Buddha said, "No, that's you're a long ways off from understanding it." And he asked the next monk, and he said, "Every time I sit down to meditate, I think this could be my last chance to meditate ever. I might die before the hour's out. I better make it count." The Buddha said, "Well, that's better, but you're not there yet." And the third monk said, "Every time I take an in-breath, I think I may not live to breathe out again. Every time I breathe out, I think I may not live to breathe in again." And the Buddha praised him as understanding the essence. In another place, he gave one of his parables or teaching stories. He said there's some kind of like a county fair. There's dancing and singing and magical tricks, and there's little booths set up, and it's all this entertainment for people. And you're charged by the king to carry this basin of precious oil that you're going to give as a reward to someone who's won a prize. And you have to walk across this field between the booths. And the king says, "Now make sure you don't spill any of the oil, and to make sure you pay attention, this guy, my guard here, he's going to walk behind you with his sword drawn, and if one drop of oil spills, he'll cut your head off." And the Buddha says, this is like being in a state of a living state, and you never know when your head's going to be cut off, and you have to be very careful, pay attention to what you're doing, stay mindful. He says, "Do you think that man would easily get distracted by the magic tricks and the dancing and the singing? Yeah. Or would he pay attention and remain mindful as he walked?" So in the big picture, the way the Buddha saw the world and life is an endless cycle of birth and death and birth and death and birth and death again and again and again. In one of his discourses, he asked the monks, "How long do you want to fill up the cemeteries? How long do you want to keep leaving your bones behind?" He said, "If you could pile up all the skulls that you've left behind in your previous lifetimes, it would make a heap bigger than the Himalaya mountains. Now, if you could gather all the blood that's been shed by you as you've been killed by sword or axe, it would be greater than the oceans." And yet beings keep wandering and wandering, being reborn into this form or that form, and eventually going through all kinds of permutations. And ultimately, there's no point to it. This is samsara, which is the meaning of wandering in a circle. It comes from the verb samsarati, which means wandering around aimlessly. And that's the nature of existence when we take into account multiple lifetimes, is aimless wandering. So the point, according to the Buddha, is not to get anywhere, to attain any particular state within this samsara, but to make an end of it, to break the cycle. Everything in this samsaric existence is conditioned. Everything in this samsaric cycle is born and dies. But there is that which is unborn and undying, that which is uncreated, unmade. Now this is the unconditioned. It's completely other than this manifest existence. manifestation into any form of being, no matter how elevated or perfect it may seem, is in a sense a kind of brokenness. It's like an imperfect shard, just by the fact of manifesting. It has no intrinsic essence. It's impermanent. It comes into being and passes out of being. And it's unsatisfying, imperfect, and suffering. And as I mentioned before, the sort of nuts and bolts level, the basic level of this process is mind seeking an object, taking the object and being unsatisfied, and then wanting to move on to the next object. At the very most basic level, that's what we've been doing for who knows how many lifetimes, and what we do continually throughout this lifetime. We seek objects, we take objects, we're dissatisfied, and we want to move on to the next object. And that process is the basis of samsara. It's the fundamental process. And what we attempt to do with Vipassana meditation is to try and make that process fully conscious. So we see the mind taking the object, we see the dissatisfaction, and we see the mind reaching out for the next object. And when that process is fully conscious, it takes the juice out of it. The energy or passion that drives it begins to wane. And it carries on for some time just out of inertia, like a flywheel in a car if you turn the engine off. But it runs down. It's not being fed new energy. So eventually it becomes so attenuated that it's possible in the next moment for the mind to do, as it were, a sideways shuffle. And in the words of the Visuddhimagga, it does that which it has not done since beginningless time, and alights upon the unconditioned, or it alights upon non-occurrence. So this is nibbana. And it's not a place or a thing or really even a state. It's just when you stop doing samsara. So it's when the mind reaches such a fine level of refinement that it decides, I don't need to do this again. What if I just stop? Oh, okay. That's what happens. And then the process of birth and death is broken. And the being ceases to wander and ceases to fill up the cemeteries.
Andamayam Dhammakataya Sadhu Karam Dadamase Sadhu